Wow, how incredibly beautiful. And I couldn't think of a better segue to our upcoming speaker, who is Rabbanit Leah Sarna, the Associate Director of Education and Director of High School Programs at Drisha. And we've invited Rabbanit Sarna to talk about exactly that. As someone who is, L'chol Banayach Limudei Hashem V'am Shlom Banayach, people who are the new Bonim and the new Bonot, what Rabbi Sachs's teachings and legacy and presence means to her and so many of her peers. So please, Rabbanit Sarna.
Thank you so much. So as Dr. Steinhain mentioned, I was asked to speak about the impact that Rabbi Sachs had on me as a young person of faith. I do want to mention that I wasn't personally close to Rabbi Sachs particularly. So unlike the previous two speakers, I'm more speaking about maybe the experience of living in a world that was kind of built by Rabbi Sachs. He became chief rabbi the year I was born. So that's kind of just to situate myself within this. I love that this event is called a Majestic Torah because that's exactly my first memory of Rabbi Sachs. I was growing up in Boston, a student at the Maimonides school, and we knew that in theory, rabbis could be majestic. Rabbi Soloveitchik's desk was in the library, his stender was in the front of the shul, but the Rav passed away when I was 2 years old. So I had excellent teachers at Maimonides, but we didn't stand up when they walked into the room and we did not treat them like royalty. I remember exactly where I was. I was sitting in room 2 after Tefillah one morning when a teacher explained to us that Rabbi Sachs was coming to visit the school. He was chief rabbi at the time, and it, of course, caught all of our attention that he had been knighted, a real-life knight coming to visit the school. How thrilling. And I personally was also interested because my Saba and Safta grew up in London, and my Saba had both studied and taught at Jews College. His sister, Ruth Royd, was the first woman to graduate from Jews College, and I knew that Rabbi Sachs had led the institution, which, as you've heard, is now the London School of Jewish Studies. My high school teacher taught us to stand up when he walked in, and we literally practiced. I remember so vividly. The door would open, we all stood up, and then the teacher taught us how to kind of navigate that tricky moment of when to know when to sit down, which is, never quite clear. Later, the whole middle and upper school gathered into the shul, and we heard from Rabbi Sachs. He told us about how he came to visit the Rav in 1968 when he was young and in search of direction. As Rabbi Sachs wrote about that visit in A Judaism Engaged with the World, quote, Rabbi Soloveitchik challenged me to think. And Rabbi Sachs was paying that challenge forward to the students at the Maimonides school. That was his main message to us, to think, to learn widely and deeply in all of our classes and in every subject. But Rabbi Sachs told us about another meeting he had on that same trip, a meeting with the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and reminded us, as he reminded many, many students in all different venues over the course of his career, that thinking alone is insufficient. It should be combined with leadership. Rabbi Sachs encouraged everyone towards leadership, men and women alike. I did not ever feel that he was only speaking to the men in the room. And when I was exactly that same juncture in my life, at the end of my time as an undergraduate, I too went on a little bit of a Rabbi Sachs inspired tour. And that's, of course, when I first met Dr. Steinhain and the other women leaders of the American Orthodox community at the time. I received a copy of Rabbi Sachs's A Letter in the Scroll as a senior in high school. This is the very one. And I read it hungrily. I have my copy with highlights and notes from the first time I ever read it when I was 17. This is a line that stuck with me, motivating my Jewish leadership as well as volunteer work that animated much of my undergraduate career, which was spent fighting homelessness in New Haven. Rabbi Sachs writes, Judaism begins not in wonder that the world is, but in protest that the world is not as it ought to be. It is in that cry, that sacred discontent, that Abraham's journey begins. At the heart of reality is a contradiction between order and chaos, the order of creation and the chaos we create. There is no resolution to this conflict at the level of thought. It can be resolved only at the level of action, only by making the world other than it is. This again touches at that balance between action and thought. Thought helps us to recognize the chaos, to ask the right questions about it, to dig deeper. But it turns out that the more you learn, the more chaos you find, both in Torah and in every other intellectual pursuit. But we can come to terms with that chaos. Rabbi Sachs further wrote, and 17-year-old Leah further highlighted, faith is born not in the answer, but in the question, not in harmony, but in dissonance. Thought, education, and scholarship lead you to see the chaos and the questions, but those very questions then lay at the very heart of faith. Questions are not the end of the line, and they're not a breaking point. They're the center of it all. Judaism, as articulated by Rabbi Sachs, calls for more than that. It calls for sacred discontent, action, protest. But what kind of action? For Rabbi Sachs, in the tradition of virtue ethics established by Aristotle, carried forward by the Rambam and many others through to Sir Bernard Williams, Rabbi Sachs's doctoral advisor, actions originate in virtuous character. And I'll caveat this whole section to say that Professor Wright and other scholars can say so much more about how he's understood amongst the field of philosophers. This is just the sliver of his thought that's been important to me. In a letter in the scroll, he wrote, Judaism from its earliest days understood the way character is formed as a series of outward movements, from family to community to people to humanity as a whole. Rabbi Sachs explored this idea further in many places, including his most recent book called Morality, where he wrote in the introduction, a free society is a moral achievement, and it is made by us and our habits of thought, speech, and deed. Without self-restraint, without the capacity to defer the gratification of instinct, and without the habits of heart and deed that we call virtues, we will eventually lose our freedom. These notions of character stemming from thought, building to habit, relationship, action, and eventually a well-balanced polity motivated my undergraduate studies in philosophy, psychology, and political theory, and ultimately led to my decision to pursue positions of leadership in the Jewish community. Change starts at home, by constant work on my own character, radiating outwards to my family, my local community, the Jewish community, and the world. The question for me was never what work I wanted to pursue. That has always been the work of Abraham, the work that Rabbi Sachs characterized as making the world other than it is. The question was only, from what perch? Where do I want to sit while pursuing that work? It can be done at any and every level. So then how do I use my skills and my interests to maximize my impact? Rabbi Sachs modeled that Jewish communal leaders can speak to the whole world. Not only can we motivate other Jews to take moral action, but that the wisdom of our ancient and precious Jewish texts can speak compellingly and urgently to the nations of the world. Until this past summer, I worked at a synagogue in Chicago called Anshe Shalom B'nai Israel, ASBI. Our synagogue was unfortunately attacked a year and a half ago. And when this happened, I was contacted by an editor at The Atlantic who asked me to write about it. I wrote up the Dvar Halacha that I had given between Mincha and Mariv on the day after the attack. It was a reflection on the first Mishnah in Bava Kama. I mentioned this to a colleague of mine, and his jaw fell open. The Atlantic published your Dvar Halacha, and other rabbis posted on Facebook, whoa, Bava Kama in the Atlantic. But Rabbi Sachs taught us that the wisdom of our tradition can speak to the whole world. I grew up in a world shaped by Rabbi Sachs, so I never doubted that readers of The Atlantic might be interested in the Avot Nezikin, and in fact they were. The loss of Rabbi Sachs is a tragedy and leaves behind a gaping hole in the English-speaking diaspora in particular. He taught us that Jewish leadership was majestic, to be honored by Jews and Gentiles alike. He gave us confidence in our tradition, that the depths of our Torah could speak in a beautiful language and rich values to the whole world. But take heart, because as Rabbi Sachs was wont to say, good leaders create followers, great leaders create leaders. Rabbi Sachs was a great leader, and he inspired generations. And all at the same time, Chaval Avdin V'lo Mishtah.